You're about to see some of the most disturbing photos in National Forest history. All of these photos are related to each other. They all exist because of the same catastrophe. But what you have to understand is that each one actually tells a very different story. Every photo that I show you and every story that I tell you is going to be more disturbing than the last. So be warned, especially because the last photo that I'm gonna show you is probably going to be burned into your brain forever, which I understand is a very bold statement, but by the time you've reached the end of this video, you're gonna understand exactly what I mean when I call this the biggest disaster in National Forest history. I'm gonna start off by introducing you to a man named Harry Truman. And no, I'm not talking about the US president. I'm talking about this man right here. I want you to take a good hard look at this photo because, as it would turn out, this photo would be one of Harry Truman's last. Oh, and the creepiest part is that the thing that took Harry's life is actually right there in the photo with him. Can you see it? In order to learn Harry's story, I need to take you on a virtual trip to the infamous Mount St. Helens. Now, this trip is totally free, but you must hit that subscribe button to cover your admission, especially if you are a repeat viewer, or especially if you want to help us reach our very ambitious goal of hitting 1 million subscribers in the year 2025. So please do that. Okay, so Mount St. Helens lies within the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, and for most people, this is a place that you just visit, probably only once in your lifetime. But for Harry Truman, Mount St. Helens was actually the place that he had called home for over 50 years of his life. Harry had served honorably in the US Army during World War I, and after returning home from the war, he leased some land right next to Spirit Lake, which is only a few miles away from the summit of Mount St. Helens. He went on to open the Mount St. Helens Lodge right there on the lake, which proved to be such a successful endeavor that Harry never worked a different job for the rest of his life. As year after year went by, Harry became very well known for operating this elegant lodge, but he also became much more well known, frankly, for being kind of a wild card, a troublemaker, if you will. He built up a very interesting, we'll say, reputation. And so here's some examples of what I mean. In one instance, Harry allegedly forged a game warden's badge so that he could go fish in a restricted area. And then in another instance, he, again, allegedly fed a Forest Service ranger a bunch of booze, got him hammered drunk, so much so that he basically let his guard down and allowed Harry to illegally burn a pile of brush on his property. And then in 1953, Supreme Court Justice, you heard that right, William O. Douglas, wanted to go stay at Harry's lodge, but for whatever reason, Harry dismissed him as, quote, an old coot, and then lied to the justice, telling him that the lodge was full. Harry didn't realize who Justice Douglas was. I don't know why he just basically told him to F off, but as soon as Harry realized that he had basically just given the middle finger to a Supreme Court justice, he changed his mind and he chased Justice Douglas down and successfully convinced him to return to the lodge. Now, those examples that I just gave you might kind of make Harry sound like a bit of an asshole, to be honest. I'm just gonna say it, but it's important to note that despite Harry's antics and his erratic behavior, he was actually very well liked within the Mount St. Helens community. There was some charm to his attitude, right? I mean, he was basically the stereotype of an old timer who was just kind of rough around the edges, but was respected for his heart of gold and his no nonsense attitude. And just to prove this point even further, Harry and Justice William O. Douglas would actually go on to be lifelong friends despite their rocky introduction. After years of running the lodge at the base of Mount St. Helens, after years of contentment, in 1975, Harry Truman's life would be turned upside down when his wife, Edna, passed away. Edna was actually Harry's third wife, but out of all three wives, she was by far his favorite, his true soulmate, if you will. They had even run the lodge together for decades, and after she passed, without her by his side, the place just felt kind of hollow for Harry. And so in order to cope with this emptiness, he turned to the two things that he knew best, which were number one, liquor, and number two, the very mountain that he had called home for so many years. After Edna died, Mount St. Helens became Harry's sanctuary. The one place that still felt the same. Harry was now in his late 70s, and without his wife around, it seems that he had actually lost a lot of his motivation. Harry had a whopping 16 cats on the property with him, and after his wife died, the once world-class lodge began to routinely, this is pretty nasty, routinely stink of cat urine, apparently. Locals began to avoid Harry because of his, increasingly hostile attitude towards everyone, and just to be totally honest, he was quickly fading into obscurity, and he probably would have been all but forgotten if not for one massive event that happened in the spring of 1980. Folks, we've already gotten into some sad stuff here, but to be honest, we are just getting started. Things are about to get really disturbing, and so before we get too much further into it, I do just want to pause for a moment, kind of lighten the mood, and tell you about Drink Element. Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. They are the best electrolyte drink mix company out there. I literally drink them every day. I just finished one right before this video. Folks, you got to replace your electrolytes, especially if you're sweating a lot, if you exercise, or just if you're a sweaty dude or woman, if you're just sweaty. I've been saying sweat a lot in this ad read. If you're sweaty, you got to replace your electrolytes, because if you don't, you're going to get muscle cramps and you're going to get fatigued. You're going to get tired. It's really just not very good. And you want to do it with Drink Element, because Element has zero sugar, zero BS. All it has is an amazing taste and the electrolytes that you need to stay hydrated. They have so many amazing flavors like citrus salt, orange salt, grapefruit salt. And so here's what you need to do, because you need to try all these flavors. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Or you can click the link right at the top of the description. Go through that link and make a purchase of whatever flavor sounds best to you. And when you do it through my link, you're gonna get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost. You can also try their Element Sparkling, like that might be a good place to start. Anyways, one more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link in the description. I know a bunch of you have seen me read Element ads over and over and over, and you haven't done it yet, so what are you waiting for? I love Element so much. Go click it. And all right, let's get into some of the more disturbing stuff here. Some of you probably already know this, but for those that don't, Mount St. Helens, the mountain that Harry's lodge was right next to, well, it's not just a normal mountain. It's an active volcano. At least it was in 1980. And in March of that year, it was becoming very clear to scientists and also to the U.S. Forest Service that Mount St. Helens was itching to erupt. Now, they didn't know when it would happen, and they certainly didn't know what the impact would be, how dangerous it would be, but they did know that the eruption was imminent, and so they got to work evacuating the area that immediately surrounded the mountain, which of course included the small community near Spirit Lake. By this point, there had already been multiple earthquakes in the area, and most of the residents had already just taken it upon themselves to leave. I mean, they didn't want to be around, it just felt dangerous. But of course, there was one Spirit Lake resident who absolutely refused to go anywhere, refused to budge, and predictably, you probably know where I'm going with this, it was Harry Truman. Harry was determined to stay no matter what. And so when all of these earthquakes began knocking him out of his bed in the middle of the night, he simply switched to just sleeping in the basement where it was safer. Harry did not care one bit what the scientists and geologists were saying about the danger. He repeatedly turned down law enforcement officials who were just begging him to leave, but he didn't turn down members of the media. He had a much different attitude towards them. Harry told members of the media things like, quote, "I think the whole damn thing is over-exaggerated. Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens are my life. you couldn't pull me out with a mule team. And he also said, quote, that mountain just doesn't dare blow up on me. I got enough food and liquor to stand a hell of a siege. And of course, finally, he said, quote, I'm going to stay right here because I'll tell you why. My home and my f***ing life's here. My wife and I, we both vowed years and years ago that we'd never leave Spirit Lake. We loved it. It's part of me, and I'm part of that f***ing mountain. Harry's attitude and defiance would soon land him on the front page of the New York Times, among other national publications. This stubbornness that had defined him for his entire life had basically turned him into an overnight celebrity because of this Mount St. Helens thing at the age of 83. By May 17th, 1980, Mount St. Helens still hadn't erupted, which only further emboldened Harry to just stay put. I mean, so much time had gone by, nothing had happened yet. You know, it just, you can kind of understand where he was coming from. It was on this day, May 17th, that law enforcement once again paid him a visit, once again begged him for his own good to evacuate Spirit Lake, and Harry, once again, told them to pound sand. Nobody knew it at the time, but it would turn out that this was Harry's final warning. The very next morning, Mount St. Helens unleashed one of the most catastrophic volcanic eruptions in US history. A massive earthquake triggered a landslide, which was also one of, if not the largest recorded landslide in history. And this landslide instantly ripped away the mountain's northern face, and it actually lowered the summit of the mountain by more than 1,000 feet. It just burst. This unleashed a violent lateral blast, sending a wave of scorching gas, ash, and debris racing at nearly 150 miles per hour, obliterating pretty much everything in its path. The sky turned black as a towering ash cloud rose 15 miles into the atmosphere, eventually spreading across multiple states. Spirit Lake was swallowed basically in an instant, buried beneath a wave of mud, fallen trees, and of course, volcanic rock and ash. This eruption left behind a landscape of devastation, flattening over 230 square miles of forest and ending the lives of 57 people. And that, of course, tragically includes Harry Truman, who refused to leave the mountain that he loved so much, that he felt so comfortable at. Harry and his 16 cats, well, they were all killed within minutes of the eruption, and, well, his body was actually never found. Harry didn't trust the geologists that had tried to warn him, and honestly, I can't really say that I blame him. You know, he was in his 80s, he'd been there his whole life. I don't know. I'm not trying to like put that on him or anything. Oh, and speaking of the geologists that were trying to warn people about the dangers, in a very ironic twist of fate, one of those geologists, who was actually one of the loudest in kind of pushing for the same evacuations that Harry ignored, well, this geologist would also end up meeting a very similar fate to Harry. Take a good hard look at this photo right here. This is geologist David Johnston, and this photo was taken at about 7 p.m. on May 17th, 1980. So leading up to this photo, Dave had spent the last few months monitoring the volcano's activity. He himself had actually made a number of trips to the summit crater, and he held the belief that the public was not taking the threat of an eruption seriously enough. And for a little more context, by May of 1980, some of the locals had grown sick of the restrictions and roadblocks, and they were applying a lot of pressure on the government to reopen certain areas close to the mountain, including Spirit Lake, by the way. And David Johnston was very vocal in his opposition to this reopening. To him, Mount St. Helens was basically a ticking time bomb, and he was determined to save as many lives as he could, even if it made him look like the bad guy in the short term. By the middle of May 1980, Dave had been stationed at the Coldwater 2 observation post, which was roughly 5 to 6 miles as the crow flies away from the summit of Mount St. Helens, which might sound very close, and in hindsight, I guess it kind of was, but despite this distance, Dave and his fellow geologists actually believed that Coldwater 2 was a safe location. On the morning of May 18th, 1980, Dave was manning the station all by himself. He awoke from his trailer, he grabbed his radio, and he kind of just began to monitor the mountain just as he had done pretty much every morning over the last few months. There was really nothing that different about this day at first. But of course, that would pretty much all change in just an instant. Because once again, at 8:32 in the morning, Mount St. Helens exploded. And it was actually David Johnston who would go down in history as the very first person to report this. Radio in hand, Dave attempted to contact his coworkers who were stationed back in Vancouver, Washington. He was heard over the radio saying, quote, Vancouver, this is it." But tragically, after this brief transmission, Dave's radio went completely silent. A few miles away from Dave, a man named Jerry Martin also had his radio out as the eruption was taking place. And Jerry watched in horror as the lateral blast swept right over Johnston's outpost. I mean, he could see it from where he was, at which point he said this into his radio.
Now we've got an eruption down here. Now we got a big slide coming off. The slide is coming off of the west slope. Now we got a whole great big eruption out of the crater. And we got another that opened up on the west side, and the whole west side, northwest side is sliding down. It's coming up over the ridge towards me. I'm going to back out of here. Gentlemen, the camper and the car sitting over to the south of me is covered. That's going to get me too. Get out of here.
And it's going to get me too. We can't get out of here. Those were his final words. And it's kind of crazy how calm Jerry sounded when he said those things, because he was right. Moments after that transmission, the lateral blast reached Jerry Martin, and just like Dave, he too was buried alive by a massive wave of boiling lava. Jerry spent his final moments doing everything he could to warn others about the danger that was unfolding right before his eyes. He spent his final moments on that radio just trying to tell everyone and warn everyone. And I think that's very commendable, frankly. And speaking of things that are commendable, to go back to David Johnston, well, he saved countless lives through his work. The U.S. Geological Survey's website says, quote, "The volcano monitoring effort of which Dave was part helped persuade the authorities first to limit access to the area around the volcano and then to resist heavy pressure to reopen it, thereby holding the May 18th death toll to a few tens instead of hundreds or thousands." I find it tragically ironic that the man who had made it his mission to protect the public from the dangers of the eruption would actually go on and end up dying because he was too close to the eruption. And with that said, I want you to look at this photo one more time. Once again, this photo was taken at 7 p.m. on May 17th, 1980, which means that approximately 13 hours later, 13 hours after it was taken, Mount St. Helens, well, it would erupt and David Johnston would obviously pass away. Therefore, this is the last photo of Dave. In 1993, some 13 years after the eruption, highway workers found a part of Dave's trailer kind of just buried while they were constructing a new road. It was buried in in more than 4 feet of ash, and this discovery brought with it a lot of optimism that maybe David Johnston's body would actually be found. However, that never happened, and to this day, he still hasn't been recovered. In fact, neither has Jerry Martin's body as well, and this is obviously the case with a lot of the 57 victims of the Mount St. Helens eruption. I say that, but that was actually not the case for the next man that I'm about to tell you about. Not only was this man's body found, but the location and configuration that it was found in tells us everything that we could possibly want to know about his final moments and his priorities right after Mount St. Helens erupted. 48-year-old Robert Landsburg had visited Mount St. Helens numerous times leading up to the eruption. Robert was a professional, award-winning photographer, and there's no doubt that he saw this unique event as an opportunity to capture some once-in-a-lifetime photos. And thus, on the evening of May 17th, 1980, Robert camped out near Mount St. Helens and wrote an ominous prediction in his journal. He jotted down the words, quote, "Feel right on the verge of something." The next morning, he drove his car deeper into the national forest, all the way until he was only 4 miles away from the summit of Mount St. Helens. 4 miles. Robert was up early, camera in hand, at 8:32 a.m. on May 18th. He had actually hiked a short distance away from his car and was taking pictures of the growing bulge on the side of Mount St. Helens when all of a sudden the earth began to shake and the mountain shot a giant wave of volcanic ash in all directions. This, of course, included Robert's direction. We don't know, obviously, how Robert felt in his final moments. We don't know if he was scared or even if he knew that he was going to die. All that we know is that Robert did make an attempt to save himself, and even more so, he made an attempt to share this historical moment, the eruption, with the world against pretty much all odds. Watching this black cloud kind of float closer to him, Robert quickly retreated back to his car and he snapped a bunch of photos along the way. Time was running out. This all happened so fast. And so after taking a few shots, all of which again showed this black cloud getting closer and closer, Robert kind of ducked into his car to take cover, but he didn't stop there. In the final few seconds of his life, Robert took the roll of film out of his camera and then he put it into a canister. He then placed the roll of film into his backpack, and then in his final action, Robert flung his body over the backpack, basically in a last-ditch effort to preserve the historical photographs that he had just taken. After this, Robert was tragically killed instantly when the cloud of volcanic ash, the very same cloud that he had just photographed, overtook him. Out of the 3 men that I've told you about in this video so far, and there's more to go, Robert Landsburg was by far the closest to the summit of Mount St. Helens when it erupted. He never really stood a chance. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. And his body, along with the wreckage of his car, was found 17 days after the eruption. But thanks to Robert's quick thinking in those final few moments of his life, he basically cemented himself as an outdoor photography legend. And I say that, of course, because his roll of film, buried deep inside that backpack and shielded by his body, well, it survived. Somehow his photos were developed, and though they were a bit damaged, they've given us a unbelievably up-close look at the Mount St. Helens eruption. I mean, these photos are truly one of a kind, and honestly, some of the most disturbing photos that I've ever seen. The massive black cloud, the fact that it gets closer with every single shot, and of course, just knowing the story behind Robert's last photos. It's just one of those things that I don't even know how to explain. Like, it just gets me. You know what I mean? Like, it just, there's just something about it. I mean, you really can't make this kind of stuff up if you tried. And as if that wasn't disturbing enough, you might be surprised to learn that Robert Landsburg was not the only photographer to die in the Mount St. Helens eruption. In fact, there was actually another man snapping away at 8:32 a.m. And it's his story that produced, in my opinion, what has to be the most disturbing photo in National Forest history. When the news of Mount St. Helens' possible eruption began to hit headlines around the US and, of course, the Pacific Northwest, nobody was more intrigued than 27-year-old Reid Blackburn. Reid was a professional photographer, and he was also an avid hiker and backpacker. In fact, he had even climbed Mount St. Helens like multiple times before. I don't mean just like hiked in the area. I mean, he had summited the mountain multiple times before. And so his knowledge of the area and of the mountain itself, his photography skills, and his experience in the outdoors basically made Reid the perfect man to document this historical eruption. And so in early May 1980, Reid would end up being stationed on the north side of the mountain near the Coldwater 1 outpost, which is different from Coldwater 2 that I told you about earlier. He was stationed at Coldwater 1, where he worked taking photos of the mountain for National Geographic and a few other publications. Reid's campsite was located about 7 miles away from the summit of Mount St. Helens. The next thing I'm going to tell you sounds unbelievable, but I swear, like, you can't make this stuff up. So Reid's photography assignment was actually supposed to end on May 17th. And therefore, on the morning of May 18th, Reid should have been safe inside his Vancouver, Washington home following the historical eruption on TV and in the news like everyone else. But instead, Reid, for whatever reason, decided to extend his assignment and decided to stay on Mount St. Helens. He had set up a few different cameras around his campsite, all of which could be triggered by his radio, and he actually kept track of each photo that he took in a very small little spiral notebook. On the morning of May 18th at 7:11 a.m., Reid took one photo and noted that the mountain was, quote, totally clear with no activity. But as you obviously know by now, just over an hour later, things would change quite drastically. It appears that Reid was at the ready when Mount St. Helens erupted at 8:32 a.m. And I say this because in his journal, he noted taking two photos, one at 8:33 a.m. and then two more at 8:34 a.m. Reid did not have any time to write down additional notes for these photos, though, because he quickly realized that he needed to flee for his life. Reid got into his car and he began speeding away from the mountain and speeding away from the wave of volcanic ash that was headed directly his way. And tragically, although unsurprisingly at this point, he didn't make it very far. The area that Reid Blackburn was trying to flee from was completely obliterated. His car was buried with hot ash, killing him instantly, and his body was found about 4 days later, still sitting, like behind the steering wheel. The car was filled with ash up to its windows. Unlike Robert Landsburg, Reid's photos unfortunately did not survive the blast, though his journal actually somehow did. And this journal shows us that Reid was committed to photographing Mount St. Helens, doing his job, trying to capture history, even in the few minutes after the eruption took place. And of course, this brings us to what I believe are probably the most disturbing photos in National Forest history. I know I've kind of said that a few times, but you're going to understand what I mean. So it's one thing to hear about Reid's car being filled with ash, but it's another thing to actually see it. As you can see here, they had to dig the car out to even reach Reid's body. The sheer destruction that Mount St. Helens unleashed on Reid Blackburn, Robert Landsburg, David Johnston, Jerry Martin, and of course, Harry Truman, well, it's one of the most sobering things that I've ever seen, even after making a lot of very sobering videos. It's just incredible to me that this one singular event produced so many unique and tragic photographs. May all of these men rest in peace, and I encourage you to leave some love for all of them, and of course their friends and family, in the comments section. YouTube seems to think that you'll enjoy watching this video next, and so give it a click. And I just appreciate you guys watching my channel so much. I have the best subscribers on YouTube, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you guys very much.